Hey guys, I'm Tyler and welcome back. Today we are going to be making this maple and metal bench to match our kitchen table. This bench is made out of solid maple. The legs are 1x2 metal tubing TIG welded together. There is storage inside for all the kitty's goodness. There are soft close hinges on there to protect the fingers. And I got some maple dovetail splines on the end for added strength. As mentioned in the intro, this bench is made out of solid maple from a buddy of mine here in southeastern Michigan, and this is salvaged maple, so even better. First off, I laid it out on the bench and struck a straight line and brought it to the bandsaw to get two straight edges so that I could work with it a little bit better on my other machines. Broke it down to rough length on the miter saw station, and then laid it on a planer sled, and I'm going to be using this to get one side flat before using the planer as it normally would be used to make the other side parallel. Using a planer sled, I'm basically able to use the planer as an upside down jointer to get one side flat before using the planer as it typically would be used to make that other side parallel. So that I didn't have to waste so much of this beautiful maple, I squared the boards up on the planer and then resawed them on the bandsaw down to a more appropriate dimension. And I would like to say here that you definitely want to let your pieces rest after your initial milling. Here you can see what one night does to the wood once it is exposed. So let it sit and then back to the planer to square everything up to your final dimensions. And then over to the table saw to cut everything down to its proper width. Once I had everything cut down to its proper width, I tilted my table saw blade to 45 degrees so that I could cut the miters on the bench. I used my Rockler table saw sled to keep everything nice and square. You never want to miter longer pieces like this just using the miter block on your table saw. And now I will cut a rabbet into the bottom of the boards to accept the base of the bench. This is done first with it face down and then with the face up against the fence of the table saw. And now for the assembly of the bench. I am going to be using Titebond 3 to allow me a little bit more open time. I'm using some picture frame clamps to allow me to clamp it at the bottom and the top. Careful alignment and good clamping pressure allowed for a nice square glue up. Miters on their own are not very strong, and because this is a bench that kids are going to be sitting on, I'm going to be adding some dovetail splines, 3 on every corner for some added strength, and they're also very decorative. I did this quickly on my router table with a dovetail router bit. Using some maple in the table saw to whip up a couple of custom dovetail splines, I added some glue and glued the splines into place. A few of them took a little bit more persuasion. And as with any glue up, good cleanup makes it a lot easier to finish later on. I'm using a straw to get into those tiny inside corners. And now I'm adding the base of the bench, and this is just going to be glued into place. Clamping the bench down with the dovetail splines overhanging either side of the bench allowed me to use a flush cut saw to cut off the remaining dovetail splines. As you probably saw in the thumbnail, there's going to be metal legs on this bench, and they're going to be indented so that the top of the bench overhangs and covers the metal strip. So I'm cutting that section out using the table saw carefully so that I don't pinch anything to accept those metal 1x2 legs. Speaking of the legs, they are made out of 1x2 steel, and I mitered them down to length using my portable bandsaw. Even just for 2 legs, there was a lot of cutting, and you gotta be super accurate when cutting metal. I cleaned up all of the joints using my angle grinder to prepare for the TIG welding. To account for any slop in the miters that I just cut, I will be welding up the legs in 2 different sections, and this will allow me to get 2 sides nice and square, and then I can weld in any gap that might be remaining between them. I'm going to be using my Lincoln Electric TIG 200 square wave in the TIG mode to be welding these together. I haven't TIG welded a ton, but I find it super enjoyable, and it takes a ton of coordination to get your foot and both hands working all in the same proper pattern. It is a lot of fun to do. I first tacked each section together to make sure I had everything nice and square, and then laid down a bead along each of the miters, and then moved on to the outside corner. I made sure to alternate around to my different miters so that I wouldn't heat up the different sections of metal too much. And there we are, 2 bench legs all welded up and ready for some paint. I used some rattle cans to first spray on some self-etching primer and then some semi-gloss enamel. Before moving on to finishing up the bench, we gotta make ourselves a bench top. A little bit of table saw planer and some routing, and then we're on to sanding everything up and getting ready for the finish. I sanded all components of the bench using my 6-inch random orbit sander up to 220 grit. And the finish is going to be 3 coats of General Finishes Armor Seal and a semi-gloss sheen. And now time to mount all of the hardware. The legs are going to be attached to the bench using 3/8-inch bolts from the inside out. So I first drilled those holes into the wood, put the legs back on and transferred the holes onto the metal, then drilled and tapped the metal, and then fastened them in place using those 3/8-inch bolts previously mentioned. This video has been sponsored by Rockler Woodworking and Hardware. Create with confidence. Visit them at their local store or at rockler.com. I'm going to be adding some soft close hinges from Rockler Woodworking and Hardware to either side of this bench to prevent the top, which is relatively heavy, from slamming down on the kid's fingers. I did have to add a spacer to be able to mount these soft close hinges out from underneath the metal legs. There's quite a bit of detailed measurements that go into place, so be sure to take your time and use a nice accurate ruler to get all of your measurements for the holes. Screw the rotation mounts into place and then mount the hardware onto the underside of the bench top to accept the other side of the soft close hinge. The soft close hinges themselves don't actually add a fulcrum for the rotation of the bench top, so you will need to add another hinge, and I'm going to be putting this onto the metal leg. It'll be drilled and tapped into the leg and then just screwed into the underside of the bench top. Here you can see how the soft close hinges first twist into the bracket on the underside of the bench top and then onto the mounting mechanism on the bench itself. They are held in place using a screw, which is easily removable if you need to. And I would say the soft close hinges are an absolute success. You can push the top down much quicker if you want to, but it closes nice and gently and no damage to your fingers. And that is it for the bench build. Time to move it inside next to our table and see how it works. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please hammer that thumbs up button. Helps us out a ton and gets this video in front of more eyes. I'm DIY Tyler, and you guys have a good one. What do you say, pickle juice? Pickle puckers? Look over there, Dad.
Pickle buggers.
Look at the camera. Smile.
Pickle buggers. Pickle buggers.
Pickle puckers?
Yep.
Look. Hey, keep your feet still. Look. Hey, smile. Everyone smile. 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 Okay, that's probably good.